The formation of Pennsylvania should have been a brilliant entrepreneurial venture for William Penn as well. He owned the largest piece of real estate ever legally held by someone other than a monarch, and he was given authority to run it like a federal lord. But feudalism was dying in England and would never take root in America. His tenants did not pay their nominal rents to Penn, who took such a steep loss on the project that he ended up in debtor's prison at the end of his life. Obstreperous, independent-minded Pennsylvanians such as Benjamin Franklin would challenge the financial and political authority of the Penn family at every turn. But if William Penn's personal affairs floundered, the city he built more than prospered. It became the cultural heart of America, serving as its first official national capital, and not coincidentally, Philadelphia was the town where both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were written and signed. In 1776, Thomas Jefferson sat at his desk in a Philadelphia hotel room trying to write the Declaration of Independence. At some point, he must have gazed out the window. His genius was that he saw what he was looking at, a nation of seekers, each chasing his vision of the future, be it religious, economic, or whatever a human being can imagine. The greatest liberty America could give them beyond the basics was the chance to chase those dreams. The Declaration guaranteed a right no one had even heard of before, the pursuit of happiness. Looking at the fast-paced, bustling streets of 18th century Philadelphia, it was self-evident to Jefferson that this unheard-of right to pursue our obsessions and wildest ambitions was inalienable. That's because the freedoms Jefferson was putting on paper were already facts on the ground, though sadly only for whites, in the new world Winthrop, Williams, and Penn had built. Jefferson saw that there was room enough in this giant land for us all to pursue our calling, no matter how wacky it might be. To understand the psychology that animates Luther-like behavior, it is important to know that Luther himself was manic-depressive. Erik Erikson diagnosed him as suffering from a severe manic-depressive state. In his famous psychobiography, Young Man Luther, and according to Goodwin and Jameson in Manic-Depressive Illness, Luther experienced periods of deep, psychotic, occasionally suicidal melancholy, alternating with periods of indefatigability and exaltation. Not everyone concurs. John Wilkinson, in his recent book, The Medical History of the Reformers, flatly refuses to accept the manic-depressive diagnosis, taking it as an article of faith that no mental disorder could have produced the historical movement called the Reformation. I would argue that it is precisely people of such temperament who produce historical movements like the Reformation. Williams became a trusted friend of the local Indians, the Narragansetts, even adopting a boy from their tribe to raise as a son. Through these good relations, Williams saved Massachusetts from Indian attacks several times, more than repaying Winthrop's generosity in saving his life. The notion that every person should be guided by personal revelation is a recurring theme in American religious history. Anne Hutchinson was banished from Massachusetts not long after Williams for preaching a similar gospel. 3. Alexander Hamilton, father of our economy. No other founder rose so far, so fast, and from so far away, beginning life as a bastard, a penniless orphan, and an immigrant, and none crashed as hard as Alexander Hamilton. The prodigy was a constant one-man charge who relentlessly attacked America's biggest problems, winning a revolution, adopting a constitution, and as his final act, single-handedly designing her economy. But Hamilton took one charge too many when he ran into an angry, unstable Aaron Burr. Hamilton lived by his hypomania and he died by it. Hamilton's life looks different through the eyes of a clinician. Three biographers resist attaching diagnostic labels to their subjects. To a mental health professional, there is no doubt that Hamilton was a bipolar type 2, someone whose hypomania alternated with major depression. While the evidence of his illness can be found in their pages, Hamilton's biographers do not even discuss the possibility that he might have been bipolar. James Flexner calls Hamilton by far the most psychologically troubled of the founders, even a semi-madman at times, without wondering if this form of semi-madness has a name. Biographer Richard Brookhiser wrote that Hamilton was subject to moods, which could be noisy and destructive as firecrackers or dark and depressed. But when we spoke, he was cool to the idea of diagnosing him as having any kind of mood disorder. Most recently, Ron Chernow has described Hamilton as a volatile personality who makes an irresistible psychological study. An exuberant genius, he worked at a fiendish pace and got himself in trouble through his arrogance, womanizing, and egregious failures of judgment. He was also not infrequently prey to depression. Yet despite this lively description of bipolar symptoms, Chernow doesn't mention bipolar disorder as a possibility worth consideration in his psychological study. The one exception to this rule is Arnold Rogow, who wrote that Hamilton showed clear signs of mania and depression and was apparently never entirely free from the symptoms of manic depressive illness. Yet even Rogow insists that we cannot know for certain that Hamilton was really bipolar because, however plausible these assessments might be, a clinical diagnosis almost 200 years later that approximates those of modern medical science is not possible. Rogow is not alone in his skepticism. Can one establish a valid psychiatric diagnosis for a historical figure? Clinicians normally diagnose living patients. Obviously, I can't conduct a psychiatric interview with Alexander Hamilton, nor administer any psychological test to him. But interviewing a patient is not the only way mental health professionals establish diagnosis. A diagnosis can also be determined by history, if we know enough details about someone's past behavior. One way of gathering that information is by interviewing people who know the subject well, usually a family member. In the case of a patient, asking informants a systematic set of questions about the presence of specific behavioral symptoms is one of the methods psychiatrists use to establish a valid diagnosis. But who can serve as an informant for a man long dead? The only valid informants I could think of were his biographers. They know him well and in an indirect way have spent a lot of time with him. It struck me as risky trying to validate my diagnosis of Hamilton by interviewing writers who had evidenced a strong resistance to diagnosing him. But I went searching for biographers nonetheless. I found 7 still alive. I was able to contact 5, and they all generously agreed to participate in my study. There are observable behavioral criteria that define every psychiatric diagnosis, so I sought the biographers' observations of Hamilton's behavior. I told the writers I was studying a particular psychological type, without naming it, and asked them to help me determine if Hamilton fit the profile. I read them a narrative description of a hypomanic, which I had composed, drawing on both the diagnostic criteria of DSM-4 and the larger clinical literature. He is filled with an unusually high degree of energy. He is restless and impatient. He is unusually active at work and other pursuits. He is quick thinking. Thoughts race through his head, and he jumps from idea to idea. He can be distracted. He talks fast. He talks a lot. and he aggressively dominates conversations. He sets goals that seem grandiose, yet he appears supremely confident of success. He feels like a man of destiny, maybe even destined to change the world in some way. He is so excited about what he believes he will achieve that he is elated or even a little high. Because his mood is infectious, his confidence can make him charismatic, persuasive, and attractive. He can be charming, witty, gregarious, and good at making people laugh. He dresses in ways that create an impression and get attention. On the other hand, minor obstacles or delays can easily irritate him, and his temper can be unpredictably explosive. He can be suspicious and hostile towards people he feels are thwarting his plans. He is impulsive. As soon as an idea occurs to him, he urgently wants to act on it, without first thinking through the realistic consequences. He is a risk-taker in general. He is a financial risk-taker, often overspending in his business and personal life. He can be a physical risk-taker. He's unusually sexually active and can be risky in his sexual behavior. He not infrequently works on little sleep. For example, rising early in the morning, full of pep, and working till late at night. I then asked the biographers if this description sounded like Hamilton. Biographers rated their level of agreement using a standard 5-point scale. 1 strongly disagree, 2 disagree somewhat, 3 neutral, 4 agree somewhat, 5 strongly agree. In answer to my first question, overall, how well does this description fit Alexander Hamilton? All the biographers agreed strongly or somewhat that Hamilton fit the hypomanic profile. The average rating was 4.6 out of a possible 5. I also asked them how well each trait fit Hamilton. They endorsed more than enough criteria to make a diagnosis. In addition, they all strongly agreed that he had suffered from recurrent and sometimes severe depressions, making Hamilton a bipolar type 2 by definition. I hope not only to show that Hamilton was bipolar, but more important, that if he hadn't been, he couldn't have led the charge to launch a nation. Hamilton's hypomania was an essential ingredient in his accomplishments, and his accomplishments were an essential ingredient in the creation of America. The rise of young Hamilton. I wish there was a war. A foreign bastard. Hamilton was born out of wedlock on the Caribbean island of Nevis, near St. Croix. In all the 47 crowded years of his life, Alexander Hamilton was never allowed to forget that he was a bastard. John Adams famously called him the bastard brat of a Scotch peddler, and Jefferson thundered, "It's monstrous that this country should be ruled by a foreign bastard." No other founder was an immigrant or came from such humble beginnings. He was the archetype of the self-made man in early American history, according to Adam Bellow. Hamilton's pedigree doesn't look promising by 21st century psychiatric criteria either. Both of his parents were unstable, restless, impulsive types, and they fought constantly. Hamilton rarely mentioned his parents, but he once wrote, "It's a dog's life when two dissonant tempers meet." Acting out in effect and affective disorder ran throughout his family tree. Among Hamilton's antecedents, adultery, theft, suicide, and lawsuits proliferated. James Hamilton, Alexander's father, was the black sheep of a noble Scottish family, a restless wanderer who traveled far from the family mains and landed in St. Croix. He was also an unsuccessful entrepreneur. Hamilton recalled bitterly that his father had been reduced to a groveling condition by becoming bankrupt as a merchant. Young Hamilton vowed that he would never allow this to happen to him. James escaped his problems by wandering away from his new family, just as he had from his family of origin. When Alexander was 9, his father got onto a ship and sailed away. Hamilton learned of his whereabouts only as an adult. He offered to bring his father to America, but James didn't come. They never saw each other again. Alexander's mother, Rachel, was a spirited, beautiful woman. Before she met James Hamilton, she had been married to Peter Levine, a merchant from Nevis. Rachel appears to have been hypersexual and ill-advised in some of her sexual liaisons. As her son Alexander would later prove to be, Rachel had numerous affairs, and after 5 years walked out, leaving behind not only Levine but also their son Peter. Levine used every means at his disposal to force Rachel to come back to him. He had her jailed on charges of abandoning her family and twice committing adultery, prosecutable crimes at least for women. But his vindictive attempts at coercion made her rebel even more. Ultimately, he gave up and sought a divorce, charging her with whoring with everyone. Under the rules of the island, Levine was free to remarry, but Rachel was not. Thus, she and James Hamilton were legally prohibited from producing legitimate offspring. After James Hamilton sailed out of their lives, Rachel needed to find a way to survive with her 2 sons. She rented a small house and opened a retail store selling food and imported items to the local plantations. She bought her goods on credit, kept her books in good order, and made her payments punctually. 12. Rachel's ability to establish and maintain good credit kept her family alive, and a lesson that would not be lost on young Alexander, who helped her in the store. He later would establish the good credit of another growing concern, the United States of America.